Kia ora everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel of hiking and photography adventures in Aotearoa. Today we're going to take your photography skills to the next level so that you can stop using those automatic settings and start using some of the manual controls on your camera that will give you more creative control over your photographs. Hey everyone, Andrew here. Good to see you again. So today we're going to be looking at the exposure triangle. Exposure is one of the critical technical skills that you will need for capturing amazing photographs out in the field. You want to capture the maximum range of detail both in your shadows and in your highlights. If you underexpose an image, your shadows will be too dark and you're going to lose detail there. Meanwhile, if you overexpose your image, you're going to have an image that's too bright and you're going to lose details in your highlights. So getting a correct exposure is essential. That will give you the most options in post-processing for creating spectacular and attention-grabbing photographs. There are three fundamental settings on your camera that are used to control exposure. Now, when you shoot in automatic mode, your camera does all the work for you and it makes things really simple. But in doing so, you lose a lot of creative control over your photographs. So what are the three settings? The first setting is a lens-based control called aperture, which controls how much light passes through your lens. The second setting is your shutter speed, which is a camera body based setting, which controls how much light passes through onto your sensor. And the final setting is your ISO, which controls the signal that comes off your sensor and is used to create photographs. Now the obvious question is, why do you need three different settings all to control the same thing? Well, the reason is because as well as controlling your exposure and how much light makes it onto your image, aperture and shutter speed also create different aesthetic results in your actual photograph. And photographers will manipulate these two settings for desired aesthetic results. That's why learning the manual controls for your camera is so critical for bringing your photography up to the next level. We're going to look at aperture first and how you can manipulate aperture for aesthetic reasons. And to do that, we're going to need to go find Mia. You didn't think I'd leave Mia out of this, did you? Come on, I know why you guys are watching this channel. It's not because of me, it's because of her. Okay, so the first setting that we're going to look at in the exposure triangle is aperture. Now, what is aperture? As I mentioned, aperture is a lens-based control for the amount of light. And what the aperture literally is the round opening in the lens that lets the light through. That hole can be made bigger and smaller to allow more light or less light in, and that is what your aperture is. As well as letting light in, it has a creative effect, which is that it changes the depth of field. The depth of field is how much of your image is sharp and in focus and how much of it is blurry and out of focus. Now, why would you want to control the depth of field? Well, depth of field is one of the most important creative controls that photographers have for making their photographs look totally badass and awesome. Now, right at the extreme end of the spectrum, you have portrait photographers who love that shallow depth of field and that big, fat, gorgeous bokeh that you get when you have your background all blurry. But at the extreme other end of the spectrum, you have landscape photographers. Landscape photographers want everything pin sharp. You remember in our earlier videos, I talked about how I needed to focus stack with miniature photography because I couldn't get a wide enough depth of field. That's because landscape photographers want everything sharp, from that sexy textured rock in your foreground, right through your midground, all the way to those badass snow-capped mountains right in the distance. You want it pin sharp to the pixel. And so you need a big, fat, wide depth of field to do that. The easiest way to understand all of this is to just see it in action, and Mia's going to help us out. So Mia's been building this fence here. She's been working hard, like all farmers do, and so we're just going to pop in and just check on her. And fence posts make a really handy way of demonstrating quite clearly how depth of field changes, because the fence posts are roughly 3 centimeters apart. So as our depth of field widens, we should be able to see more and more fence posts become crisp and clear and in focus. So when you focus at a specific point between the sensor and your subject, and that is called the focal distance. But as you get further away from the focus point, both towards the camera and away from the camera, things start to get a little blurry and fuzzy. And the further away you get, the blurrier they get. Now, the depth of field determines how quickly things get blurry. Now, there's apps you can use that will calculate your depth of field for you. And basically you program in your focus distance, your focal length in your camera, and then for given apertures it will tell you what your depth of field is. So we can do that. So if we measure our focal length, focus distance I should say, it's 0.35 meters or 35 centimeters, or just over a foot if you're American. So I'm just going to go in and focus on Mia now. I'm just going to get her eye just absolutely pin sharp there. Okay, so I use this app called Photo Pills, and I can put in all of those numbers. What this calculation tells me is that I should expect that 3 centimeters in front of that point and 4 centimeters behind that point will be in focus, and everything else is going to be out of focus. Now f5.6 to f8 I found is kind of the sweet spot for this lens and for most micro four third lenses. So at f14 we would get the Jeep in focus, but the mushroom wouldn't be in focus. And if we go all the way up to f22, that is the smallest aperture this lens is capable of. You can see that we have 16 centimeters in front of Mia and 137 centimeters behind Mia in focus. So all the way back to the birch tree, nice and crispy and sharp. I'm going to take these photographs at different apertures, and you'll be able to see just how changing the aperture changes our depth of field. So to do that, I will use my app so that I don't have to touch the camera at all, and I'm not going to have to change the settings. So I've set my focal length, it's at 12mm. I've set my point of focus nice and pin sharp on Mia's eye, and I'm starting off at f2.8, and I am not going to touch the camera again. I'm going to use my app here to change my aperture and then take my photograph. So we'll start at f2.8 and then we'll move through and we'll take some others. Okay, so I've taken a bunch of photographs at different focal lengths and I've processed them all the same way, and we're able to look at them and we can see what the result is for your photograph. So the first photograph is taken at f2.8. That's with the aperture at its very largest, allowing the most light in through the lens. And what that also does, as I explained, is it reduces your depth of field. So if we have a look at the photograph, you can see that we've got the area just around Mia and where she's putting her fence post into the ground, nice and sharp. But if we are to look a little closer at that image, what you're going to notice is that there's very little detail available sharp either side of Mia. So the fence post that's immediately behind her is still fairly sharp, but the next one back behind that, this fence post here, is a little bit blurry, and then as we go down the line of the fence they very rapidly become extremely blurry until we can't see individual fence posts at all. Likewise, if we look forward of where Mia is, you see that the fence posts get blurrier even more quickly. Now, all of our background is very, very blurry, and you'll see where there's little spots of light highlight that you create these bright round circles. That effect is called bokeh, and that is something that portrait photographers particularly like as an aesthetic choice. So if we then move up through our different apertures, what you'll see is that gradually as that aperture hole gets smaller, we get more and more detail in the image, until you get all the way up to f14. And at f14, when the hole is very, very small, you'll notice that you've got a lot of detail available in your fence posts. Not only that, but as the fence posts start to get blurrier as they move away, they get blurrier much more slowly. So even all the way back by the toadstool, there's a fairly decent amount of detail. And if you're looking at the image as a whole, you can't really tell that it's very blurry. Now, if we go right to the last image, which is at f22, you'll see that even more of the image is sharp and in focus. However, if we go in extremely closely on Mia, what you'll notice is that actually all of the image is slightly softer than it was previously, and that's a phenomenon known as diffraction. Without going into all of the technical details, at very, very small apertures, you tend to start to lose a little bit of sharpness. It's not a particularly big issue, but it could be a problem if you have particularly textured, detailed images and you wanted to print them extremely large. That's why we talk about f5.6 to f8 being the sweet spot for my particular lens. That's because at that point, the image is at its absolute sharpest across the entire frame. Then as you start to shrink that aperture down even further and get into f14 and f22, you just start to lose the tiniest bit of detail. So that's always something to consider when you're taking your photographs. Now that we've looked at aperture, we're going to have a look at shutter speed. Now, for shutter speed, I did consider using Mia once again, and I thought maybe we could revisit the river.
No. Oh, no, 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 no. Ugh. Oh, no.
Unfortunately, that didn't go so well. So we're going to go visit a real river instead, where I can demonstrate why you might want to manipulate shutter speed to give your photographs a particular creative look. This is ridiculous. It's like late April. It should be freezing and raining and cloudy and horrible. I mean, this is nuts. Any trains? sorry about the noise. We're down here at the river. The light is insane, so I want to get through this real quick so I can actually take some photographs, because holy moly, it looks gorgeous right now. Anyway, so shutter speed is the second setting that you can use to manipulate your exposure while taking photographs. And shutter speed reduces or increases the amount of light coming onto your sensor, because it's physically the gate across your sensor, and when you hit that shutter, the gate opens for a length of time and then it closes again. The longer it's open, the more light it lets in, and the brighter your exposure. If it opens and shuts really quickly, you get less light in and you get a dark exposure. But what it also does creatively is it blurs movement. So if you want that nice, crisp, frozen in time moment, you need a really fast shutter speed, because the whole time that that frame is open, everything that's in the shot that's moving is obviously going to move its position and you're going to get a blur. And if you want to do the opposite and have that really creamy, blurry movement of something in frame, you want to keep the shutter speed really wide open for longer so that you get some of that motion blurring. One of the most common ways this technique is used is for photographing water. If you want to really capture the crisp power of water and get the bubbles and the spray and all of the details, you're going to want a really fast shutter. If you want that silky, flowing, classic waterfall look, you're going to want a really slow shutter. So we've found a nice little patch of rapids here, and I'm going to just take two photographs, one with the fastest shutter I can get under these conditions, and then I'm going to throw a filter on my lens that blocks some of the light. That'll allow me to slow my shutter down, and that'll show you the effects of a slow shutter. So let's hop to it. We'll shoot it as quick as we can, because then I want to grab my G9 and snap some of this gorgeous light before it goes. Okay, so I'm back from the river and I've loaded in my photographs with my different shutter speeds. We'll have a look at them and see what the effect of changing the shutter speed has on the photograph. So this is my first photograph. I shot this at 1/250th of a second. Now that was kind of the fastest I could get under the conditions that we had. Ideally, if you want to freeze motion, depending on what that motion is, you may need a much faster shutter speed. But if you look at the photograph, you can see that the texture and the bubbles and a few splashes in the water and so on, and see all those rapids fairly well. Now, to get that shutter speed, I had to shoot at quite a wide aperture, so you'll notice the back of the photograph is a little blurry. Certainly not a great photograph, but it serves the purpose. And then I put a variable ND filter on and closed that right up so that we could get the slowest possible shutter so that I could demonstrate the difference of effect. So this is the second photograph. This is taken with a variable ND filter, closed right down to block out most of the light going into the camera so that I could slow down my shutter speed. So this was shot at 1 second, and you can see, looking at the water in the river this time, that it's got that smooth, glossy effect that you get with slow shutters, and that you may have seen online with people's photographs, particularly of waterfalls and surf on the beach and things like that. So that's a demonstration of the effect. Now, as I said, these are not great photographs, but I did take a couple of other photographs that do demonstrate the same effect. So these photographs I'm much happier with as images, and I'll share them with you as well. So this is at 1/40th of a second, so it's still fairly slow, but you are seeing a bit of detail and texture in the water and in the rapid there, which is an effect you get with a quicker shutter speed. Then the second photograph taken at 1.6 seconds, so much longer shutter, and you can see that that water's a lot glossier. Now, you could have reasons for either effect. As I said, if you want to freeze motion and capture fine detail, you want that fast shutter. So even for water, a blurry, slow shutter is not necessarily what you want. A good example might be surf spraying on a beach or off rocks. If you want to capture all those fine droplets suspended in the air, you're going to want a fast shutter speed. And then, as I've mentioned many times, the slow shutter is very popular for flowing water to give it a smooth, soft effect. It can also be used to blur cloud, so you can use it to create star trails and use it to create long blurring lines of traffic, taking photographs of, say, highway at night or something like that. So there's lots of aesthetic effects that you can use by manipulating your shutter speed. So the final side of the exposure triangle is ISO. And to understand the effect of ISO, we're going to have to wait till it's dark and then head outside and have a look at the stars.
Hey everyone, so we're here outside at night to talk about the last setting in the exposure triangle, which is ISO. For now, let's just say that ISO is the amplification of electronic signal coming off your sensor that your camera turns into an image. So in a situation where there's lots of light hitting the sensor, the signal coming off the sensor will be nice and strong, which means that the noise coming off the sensor is quite low relative to it, and you get a nice clean signal that you can make a nice clean image out of. But when the light's low, you get a weaker signal coming off the sensor, which means relative to that signal, the noise is quite high. As you amplify the signal, you also amplify the noise, introducing noise into your image. Noise manifests itself as a loss in dynamic range, a loss in color saturation, and a loss in contrast. It also introduces grain to your image. So there's a sacrifice in terms to the technical cleanness and quality of your image that can then cause you issues in post-processing, because you have less latitude to start editing your image because of all the noise. So we're going to just set up a little shot here and photograph some stars, and I'm going to turn this light off here so that A, I can see the stars, and B, I'm not blinded anymore, because right now I can barely see a thing and I'm sure I look horrendous. But unfortunately, as I've mentioned in a previous video, I don't really have any proper light, so I'm just using that good old work light again, and it's just blasting in my face and I'm going blind. So I'm going to go now, but we'll set up and I'll see you back inside.
Hey everyone, so that was fun. It's the next day. I'm still wearing the same clothes, so in actual fact it's taken me about a week to shoot this video, and every time I've appeared on camera I've had to dress up in the same clothes, and it's actually getting a little bit stinky. So I mean, no one really told me this YouTube thing would be such a pain in the ass. I don't know, do you guys care if I randomly change clothes halfway through a video? Let me know. Anyway, so ISO. Now ISO is a really interesting one because there's no real aesthetic effect to having ISO. It's more about a loss of technical cleanliness and quality in your image, which has detrimental effects with post-processing. So I've taken a bunch of star photographs. Now, as I said, I'm not an astrophotographer and I don't have the best equipment for it. I've also done single exposures to keep things simple. But it was pretty cool. I bought my Leica 10-25 1.7 lens specifically for a bit of astrophotography because it's nice and wide and fast. I haven't as of yet had the opportunity to use it for astrophotography, so this video gave me that opportunity, so thank you very much. I was, to be honest, quite blown away with the results. So the first image is taken at ISO 800. Now this is a fairly high ISO to shoot at for the Micro Four Thirds camera. I tend to shoot most of my landscapes between 100 and 400, and I find that is where you get the cleanest result. However, I have found that up to about 1600 I can get a pretty usable photograph, and then after that it all starts to fall apart. So here's at ISO 800. As you can see, the picture's pretty clean. You've got good detail in the stars, good contrast, and it's a pretty pleasing photograph. To be honest, I was quite impressed with how sharp this lens is. I've then applied the exact same edit to all of the other photographs so that you get a comparable result. So as we move up through to the other ISO settings, you'll see the quality of the image will very rapidly degrade. So this is at 1600 ISO. I consider this the limit for really usable images as single frames from Micro Four Thirds cameras. It's okay, but you can see there's quite a lot of color cast in the sky. It's starting to get a kind of aqua teal effect, and it's not quite so clear and crisp with those stars. Then as we go up to 3200 and then over 12,000, things really start to fall apart, as you can see. And at the highest ISO the camera can take photographs, which is 25,600, you can see the photograph is really barely usable. It looks like it was taken on an old Nokia cell phone camera from the early 2000s. Now, there are full frame cameras that have usable images at much higher ISOs than I can use my camera. One of the things to remember about ISO is that because it involves image processing after the signal has left the sensor, it's different for every camera. So you can't apply the same expectations and rules to different models of camera with different sensor formats, or even cameras within the same sensor format, because manufacturers use different processes to try clean up that signal. So there are full frame cameras that shoot quite happily at 3200 and 6400 ISO. Sony cameras in particular have a reputation for working well in low light. Smaller sensor cameras generally have more noise, and therefore as you increase the ISO you get noisier images and they're not really usable. So there you go everyone, that is the exposure triangle. I hope you've learned a few things from my video and are inspired to head outside and flick your camera dial to aperture or shutter priority and start experimenting with bringing a little more creativity and control into your photographs. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you're all well, and I will see you again soon. Take care.